I'm going to talk a little bit about the environmental aspect of conflict, in that we heard Luca mention climate shocks and the necessity to deal with the politics of food crisis. We also heard Maria talk about displacement in terms of natural disasters and in terms of conflict, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the overlap between the two, the sort of multi-directional relationship between environmental change and conflict and disruptions in food and water systems. So when we talk about environmental change, it can incorporate a really broad range of issues. It can mean ecosystem damage, it can mean changing water demands and land use, and it can be caused by and lead to various types of migration. So where we find agricultural production or markets disrupted by these changes, conflicts can restrict food and water even further, and the insecurity that comes with it can trigger riots, even revolutions, with competition over resources. We found that for example, we found that with the power dynamics of shifting water supplies in Syria, for example, due to changes in local ecosystems and the subsequent migration from rural to urban areas, these are at least partially linked to grievances and uprisings preceding the civil war there. We see in Yemen the de facto blockage of Port Hodeida, for example, and the food restrictions and the water restrictions there are going to be hurting an entire generation of Yemeni children, assuming they survive this conflict. So there's quite a bit of sort of multi-sectoral relationships there. We see with long-running conflicts, so you find soil damage as a result in certain contexts. You have interrupted crop harvests and animal herding, and in many cases, few resources to return to once the violence is over. Climate change and agricultural production are, of course, intrinsically linked. So, of course, there's a high sensitivity to environmental changes in terms of production, but people do adapt. And as Luca pointed out, it's important to combine the humanitarian assistance and development efforts, which can mean different things in different contexts, and some of my colleagues have been speaking about that already. And I won't go into lots of detail, but there is an element of, for example, we see communities doing this by themselves, and we see this being part of development programs too, to help them, where you've got altering cultivation and sowing times, for example, different species that are being cultivated, sometimes with shorter cultivation periods. We find in certain contexts even aquaculture being adapted to cope with warmer waters, for example. So, and while sometimes I think we miss that humanitarian organizations do have quite a rich experience of local context and can quite easily help with development efforts and vice versa, that relationship, I think, needs to be more solidified. There's a tension between, I think, those two types of organizations sometimes in the real world. And in terms of the research and the policy evidence that underlies these programs and projects that are designed to help, they have to be interdisciplinary. One of the struggles that I find with bringing environmental scientists and political scientists and economists all in the same room is often we simply don't speak the same language. And getting over that barrier to actually produce effective and cost-efficient programs and be able to cultivate the evidence to keep fine-tuning those programs can be quite challenging. We need to combine all of those resources to be able to identify tipping points in situations where the combination of a climate shock and conflict will lead to a crisis. And we're getting better at that. We do have better and better data all the time. And we are making a better sort of effort in terms of combining the qualitative evidence around that as well. Ultimately, it's important to recognize that hunger is a political problem in these contexts, and not to use, I think, in a larger picture sense, to ensure that donor governments too don't use foreign aid and assistance as a bargaining chip in negotiations over migration policies as well. It's important to, in that process, to ensure that no one's left behind and consider things like the gender dynamics of conflict and climate shocks, that restricted access to food and water may have a particular impact on women and girls. There are particular types of violence in political situations that will affect girls and boys differently, potentially. and also that displacement has an impact on conceptions of masculinity as well, and that there are different identities that are affected differently. We had Daniel talk about mental health, and that's quite important in this context as well, that there are different identities that are affected differently in these contexts. So I hope we can talk a little bit more about that.